Hello and welcome to our special coverage of the Russian invasion of Ukraine. I'm Ladi Akiridoluale. The headlines. Strike kills at least 3 people as Russian rocket destroys Kramatorsk apartment building. Austrian president meets President Volodymyr Zelensky, sees no possibility of peace talks soon. And Russian President Vladimir Putin says shelling of Crimea, Russian regions must be stopped. A Russian rocket has destroyed an apartment building in the eastern Ukrainian city of Kramatorsk late, killing at least 3 people and leaving more than 20 injured. According to the police, Russian troops targeted the residential area of the city with an Iskander-K missile. At least 8 apartment buildings were damaged and one of them was completely destroyed. More than 100 police officers are working to rescue people from the rubble after the missile attack. Authorities are also evacuating people to a local school for shelter. Meanwhile, Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky has condemned that strike and expressed condolences to the families and friends of the victims. In his nightly address, Mr. Zelensky said the situation on the front lines in eastern Ukraine has become tougher as Russian forces step up an offensive in another gloomy military assessment from Kiev.
We
will not allow anyone to weaken our state. Disciplinary proceedings have been initiated against some of those dismissed. Unfortunately, there are some sectors where the only way to guarantee lawfulness is changing top officials along with institutional change. There will be as many changes as is necessary so that at last people will not end up getting dirty in their positions. Of course, today I held several quick meetings with our military. A definite increase has been noted in the offensive operations of the occupiers on the front in the east of our country. The situation has become tougher. We've stood firm all this time, from February to February. We all have to be especially united, especially focused on state interests, and as a result, especially resilient. I believe we will succeed.
And British Defence Secretary Ben Wallace says the country is focused on providing armour and tanks for Ukraine. The British Prime Minister, Rishi Sunak's spokesperson, had said before that it would not be practical to send jets to Ukraine because it would take months to learn to fly them. But Mr. Wallace said Britain's jets were very complex and might not be applicable in Ukraine.
Well, we're here with our counterparts from Australia, the Defence Minister and the Foreign Minister, looking at UK and Australian troops with our international friends and allies, training the volunteers from the Ukrainian army to help them defend themselves against Russian aggression.
What they need right now is armour and tanks, and that's what we not only led from the front with the First Nation, but also sought to engineer a greater support. And now we've unlocked that. And a few weeks ago, they needed desperately air defence. Again, we were at the forefront in helping them do that, and now helping them deliver an effective plan to protect the critical infrastructure. We have our Typhoons, which we use today to patrol the skies right now, to protect our assets, to guard things in the Black Sea, to guard people up in the high north. We're using them. There's a first point, but secondly, I think we have to be pretty sure that that is going to be the next battle-winning requirement. But for now, I think we are focused on the tanks, the land battle, and the ability. And aircraft are there to deliver 2 things: air defence, but also surface strike. Well, HIMARS, M270s, the extra ammunition artilleries we're putting in, the UAVs we supply to help them be better target, has a similar effect. Let's deal with capabilities one step at a time, as is requirement. What's going to move on this conflict this year is going to be the ability for the Ukrainians to deploy Western armour against Russia. Both Russia and Ukraine are finding it hard to fly their planes, partly because of the anti-air defences that we have donated. Russia, for its massive air force, has had very little ability to deliver effect. There are other ways we can also contribute to delivering effect at a longer range, and I've said I've been open to looking at those.
In the meantime, former British Prime Minister Boris Johnson has asked world leaders to counter their initial resistance to supplying Ukraine with increasingly sophisticated defense systems and give Ukrainians the tools to finish the job. Speaking during an event at the Atlantic Council in Washington, Mr. Johnson said, quote, "My argument to everybody today is if that is where we're going to end up, let's do it now and let's stop the delay."
If Putin had won a year ago, as he thought he would, as his generals told him he was going to, indeed, frankly, as our generals, ladies and gentlemen, told him he was going to, then that would have emboldened the Kremlin to increase the intimidation and threats towards every country and region on the fringes of the old Soviet Empire. It would have told the Chinese all they need to know about our reluctance to stand up for freedom and democracy in the South China Seas or anywhere. It would have sent a signal to every opportunist autocrat around the world that international borders are fungible and frangible and can be changed by force, and that no one will do a damn thing to stop them. Look, I think the answer to that is look at what's happened. Every time we come to a fork in the road and we're asked to make a choice about sending some new type of weaponry to Ukraine to help them, we begin by saying no, and we begin by saying this is an escalation, this is a provocation, we mustn't do this. And I had this argument about the NLAWs, the anti-tank missiles, and then we've had it about all sorts of things. In the US, it was a very strong argument about the HIMARS, which then proved so valuable. So all I'm saying is experience teaches us that when it comes to it, we finally decide to let the Ukrainians have what they need to defend themselves. And so my argument to everybody today is that if that is where we're going to end up in our ratiocination, then let's do it now. And let's stop the delay. And I implore you now to follow the logic of what you are all doing and give the Ukrainians the tools to finish the job. Give them the deep fire artillery systems, give them the tanks, give them the planes, because they have a plan. They know what they need to do, and my God, they've shown they have the skill and the bravery to do it.
Former British Prime Minister Boris Johnson. And Ukraine's defense minister says that Ukrainian lives will be saved by a sophisticated air defense radar that France is supplying to Kiev. Speaking at a handover ceremony, Oleksiy Rezhnikov described the French-made GM200 as a very effective improvement for Ukraine's network of about 300 different types of air defense radars. Thales, the manufacturer, says the radar detects and tracks rockets, artillery and mortar shells, missiles, aircraft, drones, and other threats. Mr. Rezhnikov said at the ceremony in Dimor, where Thales makes the equipment, quote, "Because of your support, Ukrainian lives will be saved." And Germany's defense minister Boris Pistorius says the country needs to order new Leopard tanks quickly to replace those going to Ukraine, adding that he did not care where the money came from. Speaking to reporters on a visit to a tank battalion in the western town of Augustdorf, Mr. Pistorius said, quote, "For me, the crucial fact is that we have to order new tanks, not in a year, but swiftly, so that production can begin," which has been chosen to supply 14 of the Leopard tanks to Kiev. Where will the money come from? Let me casually put it like this. Frankly, I don't care. It is essential that we can provide them, that is the tanks, very quickly. Mr. Pistorius aims to accelerate arms procurement and ramp up ammunition supplies in the long term after almost a year of arms donations to Ukraine has depleted German military stocks. And Austrian President Alexander Van der Bellen said he was open to hosting peace talks in Vienna over Russia's war in Ukraine, but did not believe the prospect of negotiations were close by. Mr. Van der Bellen held talks with Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky in the Ukrainian capital, Kiev. During the news conference that followed the meeting, Mr. Zelensky accused Georgian authorities of torturing the jailed former president of Georgia, Mikhail Saakashvili, who holds Ukrainian citizenship. Mr. Saakashvili was sent to prison in 2021 for 6 years on charges of abusing his power while president, a charge he has denied and says is politically motivated. His health has deteriorated significantly in prison, where he has staged repeated hunger strikes and alleges he was poisoned. He is currently being held and treated in a clinic in the Georgian capital, Tbilisi. And Russian President Vladimir Putin has told a government meeting that shelling of Russian regions from Ukraine must not be permitted. And that's according to a report by state media outlets. Mr. Putin was quoted as saying that the priority task is to eliminate the very possibility of shelling. But this is the business of the military department. The meeting was due to address the restoration of residential infrastructure in the Crimean Peninsula, which Moscow seized from Ukraine in early 2014, and the border regions of Belgorod, Bryansk, and Kursk. Let's talk now to Stephen Hayes, President, Cohen Woods International. Of course, Stephen Hayes is deeply associated and has been with the Corporate Council on Africa, as well as the American Center for International Leadership. Morning to you, Stephen. Nice to see you, as always.
Well, good morning. It's a dark morning here in Canada, but it's good to see you too.
Thank you very much. Stephen, of course, is joining us from New Brunswick this morning. Now, are you surprised, Stephen, given that all you know, are you surprised that at the end of the day, just like Boris Johnson has just said, that, look, it all starts with no, and then eventually it's all right, we're going to do it. And that so it's happened with equipment, it's happened now with tanks, and so it will be with planes.
Well, it's certainly been the pattern. I mean, it's hard to disagree with Boris Johnson in this case. We do start with let's not be hasty, and then we do have to build up. And I think it's almost I would agree with him that it's almost inevitable that we need to be supplying now if we're going to protect Ukraine and the values that they represent.
Given the fact that at the very start, which was something else Mr. Johnson said, everyone expected, even the Western generals, the generals of the Western armies, expected that Russia would have this in hand within a week. But that has not proved to be the case. I mean, in a couple of days, it'll be 1 year since all of this started, and still there is no clear victory in sight for the Russians. Do you perhaps think that at this point, what we talked about earlier, which is that there's going to be a balance of forces, a balance of, shall we say, terror, if you like, on the battlefield, that at the end of the day, those who are saying, look, can we at least talk about talks, just like the Austrian president, the Turkish president, and a couple of others who have said, look, you're still going to talk, so you might as well do so. Do you think that's where we're going to end up?
I think it has to end up that way. I don't see a total victory for either side on this one. And of course, you're right. I was among, as almost everybody else was a year ago, thinking this war wouldn't last more than a month. But it clearly is going to be a long-term engagement. I think now there will be a stronger Russian push because of the tanks coming into Ukraine. And I think that at some point there's got to be some settlement to this. Otherwise, we're moving much further than just a Ukraine-Russia war. We're moving to a far greater tragedy that reminds me a lot of the prelude to World War II.
Given that, and when we talk about the balance, of course, you're very familiar with many of the powers that are involved in all of this, the Western powers. I don't know if we'll call them the Eastern powers now, talking about India, China, Iran, and so on, the North Koreans and all of that. As the West has seemingly gotten more deeply involved, because this is, whichever way we look at it, an escalation, tanks, planes, and so on. What is just left is for boots on the ground. But maybe that will come on if the battle lasts for longer or for long enough. On the other side, the Russians will also expect the Chinese, the Indians, the North Koreans, the Iranians, and a couple of others who have remained behind the scenes to step up their support for Russia. Am I wrong in assuming that?
I don't anticipate the same degree of support for Russia, and I also think that China is going to be very, very careful right now. I think it's, in my view, unfortunate that we spoke about the possibility. One of our generals spoke about the possibility of war with China within 2 years. I don't think that helps the situation, but I think that China has played obviously it's played a bias towards Russia, but I still think that they're going to be very careful how they proceed. Their economy is dependent on their relationship with the United States, for a starter. Iran, certainly it's already in the war in terms of helping Russia. North Korea has always been there, so it's no shock. I think I don't anticipate India coming in as much as I do, but so something like Iran, I think India will maintain neutrality. But the China role continues to be intriguing more than any other because of its own tensions, its leadership with a full-time term now that's goes back to Mao days, in fact. So I think it's still uncertain, and I hope it remains uncertain for a while in terms of China's role. But I think China could play a more positive role if it chooses to. But I think that its relationship with the United States and what we say, frankly, is going to affect China as well.
Let's go behind the scenes, Stephen, and I want to tap your experience in this field from long years of association. Elections are looming on the horizon for some of the big Western powers. Elections are due in the United States in 2024. Elections are due in Britain about the same time, if not sooner, depending on how the political developments happen. And then a couple of the other countries as well may be looking at elections. And this is all happening within what you might call economic challenges at various levels, different levels of economic challenges. On the other hand, the war has also sapped quite a bit of funds and will from the Western powers, partly because of how long it has taken. Do you think all of this in the mix could have some impact on how much the Ukrainians in particular can expect that the West will continue with this robust support going forward?
Well, certainly Mr. Putin hopes that's the case. And I think realistically, we are going to have to look at the balance of economies, how our own personal economies are affected, and how much we can really help economically and militarily, but I say militarily because it depends on our economics, the Ukraine. And I think the political will is going to be hard to maintain, but it's not impossible. I think the political will in the UK historically will probably remain fairly strong, even if Labour were to win elections. The case in the United States, I think the overwhelming majority of the United States still is the population is very supportive of Ukraine. How though the minority within Congress, which has, I say the minority within the Republican Party particularly, how that affects the Republican Party leadership, and it will have some effect, is going to have a big determinant in terms of how the United States moves forward. I think over the next 2 years, particularly how Mr. Biden and the Speaker of the House work together is going to be very interesting. I think that Speaker McCarthy would like to work a little more closely with the administration, but I think his own party is going to make it very difficult for him to state that. But there needs to be a working relationship between the administration and leadership in the House of Representatives, as well as, of course, leadership in the Senate. I think support for Ukraine within the United States will be the key factor is the Senate. And I think the Senate remains very strong, including the Republican leadership there, in terms of supporting Ukraine. So I think for the next 2 years, at least until the elections, Ukraine can count on U.S. support. I think that they'll probably be able to count on it after that as well. But the economy is going to have a big effect. and that is unknown. The Fed has increased rates yet again, but at least not at the same degree as they have. So I think that there's a lot of questions to remain. I don't think they can be easily answered, and I think anyone who says that they have the answers, I wouldn't count on it.
I do, of course, want to ask you one other question, which has to do with the difference between the military, as you identified, and the economics. NATO is a purely military alliance, and that the war in Ukraine has brought together. It's given NATO renewed relevance, just as people were beginning to ask questions about how relevant it was. And then on the other hand, you have the European Union and then the United States. The economics of all of this has tended to take a back seat to the military part of it, because that's the one that is in the media highlights and all of that. But in terms of economics, this has also affected relationships because quite a number of the countries have also had to, quote, fend for themselves, as it were, even within the union. So take a country like Germany, for example. Germany produced its own plan for getting gas outside of the EU. So going forward, I want to find out from you, was the war in Ukraine something that brought forward difficult conversations that now need to be had, but which all along had been kicked down the road?
Well, I think the answer to that is yes. I think those conversations are happening, and I think that what's becoming clearer is that there seems to be a greater unity now in Europe than frankly existed before the Ukraine war. I think that there was always a certain reluctance among allies to totally agree. I think the situation in Ukraine and the perceived, and I'm going to say perceived threat that Russia represents beyond Ukraine has brought countries together. The NATO alliance has gotten stronger. You're absolutely right on that, and then suddenly it becomes more relevant. I think what will happen is that what has to be asked is the role of some countries within the European community as well as NATO. And one of those countries is going to be Turkey. They're going to play an interesting role, and how long they can play that role is going to be determined largely by the allies in the West.
Indeed. Stephen Hayes, as always, thank you for your time, for your experience. We've been doing this together now for almost a year as we've been following all the developments. Thank you so very much.
That's true.
We've also been following you as you've gone from one part of the United States to the other, and then of course on to Canada as you go about. Do stay safe, my friend. Thank you.
It's very cold. It's very cold here.
Indeed, it is. Right. Canada is known for cold. Indeed. That's it. Thank you very much.
Bye-bye. Thank you.
Bye-bye now. Thank you. After the break, Sweden says religion is not part of the NATO deal with Turkey. Details in a moment. Please stay on with us. Thanks for staying tuned. Welcome back. The Kremlin has welcomed the Russian company's offer of bounty payments for soldiers who destroy Western-made tanks on the battlefield in Ukraine, saying it would spur Moscow's forces to victory. The Russian company, Forus, this week offered 5 million rubles, which is $72,000 in cash, to the first soldiers who destroy or capture US-made Abrams or German-made Leopard 2 tanks in Ukraine. Kremlin spokesman Dmitry Peskov said Russian troops would burn any Western tanks that were delivered to Ukraine, adding that the bounties were extra encouragement for Russian soldiers. Swedish Foreign Minister Tobias Billström says his country is implementing an initial deal agreed with Turkey on its NATO membership, but that compromises on freedom of expression are not part of the pact. Turkey, having signed a memorandum at a NATO summit last year to clear the way for Sweden and Finland to join, has been angered by a series of protests in Sweden against Turkey and its president, Recep Tayyip Erdogan. Right-wing Danish-Swedish politician Rasmus Paludan set a Quran on fire in one protest, and Mr. Erdogan has now held out the prospect that Turkey could allow Finland to join, but not Sweden. Mr. Billstrom says that religion is not part of the agreement that was signed with Turkey. And security services have searched the home of one of Ukraine's most prominent billionaires, moving against a figure once seen as President Volodymyr Zelensky's sponsor in what the authorities called a wartime anti-corruption purge. The action, days before summit with the European Union, appears to reflect determination by Kiev to demonstrate that it can be a steward of billions of dollars in Western aid and shed a reputation as one of the world's most corrupt states. The SBU had said it had uncovered the embezzlement of more than $1 billion at Ukraine's biggest oil company, Ukrafta, and its biggest refiner, which are both controlled by Igor Kolomoisky, who has long denied wrongdoing and held stakes in both firms, which Mr. Zelensky has now ordered seized by the state under martial law. Mr. Kolomoisky, who faces a fraud case in the United States, has been at the center of corruption allegations and court disputes for years that Western donors have said must be resolved for Kiev to win aid. Mr. Zelensky, who first came to fame as the star of a sitcom on Mr. Kolomoisky's TV station, has long promised to rid Ukraine of so-called oligarchs, but had faced accusations that he was unable to move decisively against his former sponsor. Meanwhile, another initiative as part of the anti-corruption series was the unsealing of an alleged scheme by the acting head of the Kiev Tax Authority to look the other way on 45 billion Ukrainian hryvnia, that's about $1.2 billion in unpaid taxes. The State Bureau of Investigations has said it had found hundreds of thousands of dollars in cash, as well as luxury watches and cars at the residence of the head of the Kiev Tax Authority. The head of the authority, along with other members of the commission, made decisions on compliance or non-compliance with the risk criteria of taxpayers without legal grounds, which led to serious consequences. The recent findings from the anti-corruption searches come after President Volodymyr Zelensky fired a slew of senior Ukrainian officials amidst a growing corruption scandal linked to the procurement of wartime supplies in the biggest shakeup of his government since the Russian invasion began. Let's talk now to Mr. Oluseyi Adeyemo, public policy analyst, who joins us virtually from the nation's commercial capital. Good morning to you, Mr. Adeyemo. Thank you for your time.
Thank you so much for having me, Laddie. It's always a pleasure to be on your program.
Are you surprised, given what you know about Ukraine, that we're having this corruption scandals and the investigations of some of the really top officials, and then now even the president himself is being touched in a way because the anti-corruption is touching one of his biggest backers and sponsors in power?
Okay, I mean, if I would answer this question this way, knowing what I know about them, yes, I'm surprised. But knowing what I know about human beings all over the world, I am not surprised. Human beings will be human beings. And that's why this war has tarried this long. There's always all sort of things to deal with. I mean, for me, what I have sort of learned from this war is that as human beings, we would be testing our will, our character every other time, almost on a daily basis, including you and I. And that, in my opinion, is the most critical lesson to take from all of this. The character of Zelensky as the president of Ukraine is being tested in the way he has stood his ground, in the way he stood up to the war, a war that a lot of us thought will be over in 1 month. The way he's been able to stand, not minding his background as an actor or as a comedian, he has, for me, proven that when a man has a character, he's able to withstand all of this. So character is being put to test, and all of us as human beings, when opportunity or situations or events like this happen, is when you really know who we are.
Now, I'm just seeing some visuals on my screen there of the man I was referring to, Igor Kolomoisky, and he, of course, was instrumental to President Zelensky taking power a couple of years ago, and he's one of the richest men in Ukraine. As has been reported, he's had quite a lot. But isn't Mr. Zelensky taking a big risk here in taking on someone so powerful and who was instrumental to his rise?
Again, I want to speak to the things you talked about earlier with Stephen. You're talking about balance. And so at every point in time when you're taking a decision, you must be able to balance it out. Yes, you want to be cautious because you're dealing with a very strong person who has very strong political stand. But at a point like this, when you're at war, and you're expected, and again, your own character is being put to test on how you're going to deal with this, whether you're going to be decisive, whether you're going to be panning to your political strength or your political highlight. You also must be able to, balance and be able to take a decision that truly speak to who you are as a person. Because at the end of the day, some people will go in and out of government. History will vindicate them, and they'll be described as a man or a person of character. So I believe that Zelensky, in my own opinion, has been able to show the world that he's a man with a very strong character. And I'm expecting that at the end of the day, the decision he will be taking will be one that is balanced and be able to speak to the fact that he wants to take the people of Ukraine now in this case as the most important people to him taking the right decision that he needs to take.
Let's leave the corruption or anti-corruption battle for a couple of moments and go to the battlefront now. I guess because you had said so before that it was likely that at the end of all the huffing and puffing, Ukraine was going to get its tanks. So I won't ask the question whether or not you were surprised that they got the tanks. But because of delivery issues and training issues, the impact of these tanks is not going to be immediate. That's number one. Number two is that now that they seem to be getting the tanks, they're asking for aircraft.
They'll keep asking for more. You see, the truth of the matter is it's war, and you're depleting your arsenal as you employ or deploy those things that you have. And I mean, sometimes it's not even enough to even deploy them. The most important thing in war or at war is you having them, and your opposition or your enemy begin to realize how strong you are. So yes, they're getting the tanks, and the tanks are not on ground yet, but they're already asking for aircraft. They will ask for more. Truth is, they would continue to. And I think, again, you have helped me to also speak to Zelensky's character. He's been able to persuade, because it's not been easy getting anything out of anybody, because they also are very careful the way they're releasing some of these things, the way they're looking at, okay, are we comfortable with really releasing these things? I mean, when they consider political, economic factors and all of that, but it's been able to do a very, very good job in convincing them. And I think for me, those are the things that I have admired, about this man in all of this. So yes, he's asked for tanks, he's gotten tanks, he's asking for aircraft. If he eventually gets aircraft, if there's a need for him to ask for more arsenals, I assure you he will go ahead and ask for them.
Now, but let's look at the other side, shall we? There's not too much noise being made, but the reports are there, admittedly, that the Russians are making advances, particularly in the east. Slow grinding advances, but advances nevertheless. And we have been hearing for weeks that they are preparing a major new offensive, and that they are going to deploy new weapons that they hadn't used before, such as the hypersonic missiles and a couple of their own new tanks, since they say the West is supplying Ukraine with tanks. So again, there's still going to be more bloodshed.
Unfortunately, yes, because again, you don't expect a Putin to easily cow out of this and say, oh, everything is all won, and so it's going to just walk out. His personality, you expect him to fight to the end of the day. Unfortunately, he's doing, and an exercise with Belarus right now. They're doing all sort of things, you know, on the ground and all of that to ensure that, I mean, on his own end as well, is showing strength. I mean, I must also subtly confess that I admire the fact that he's been able to hold this family, because I thought that when this has lasted this long, it probably will be panning more to negotiations and it will start to recline. But obviously that will have been a disappointment, because then that will not be real Putin. Putin is the kind of person, the kind of character he is the kind of one that fights to the end. So yes, I'm not surprised. He's obviously reaching out to his allies. He's talking to people as much as he can. He's getting help as much as he can. Unfortunately, because of the way all of this has been painted, because of the humanitarian thing, those people who are lending help cannot publicly come out like the West is coming out for Ukraine. But obviously, he's also talking to his own allies, and he's definitely getting help and support from them. And like you rightly pointed out, he's going to be deploying new arsenals that they've not deployed up till now. And it's unfortunate because, like you rightly pointed out, that will be more bloodshed and more people dying, which is something we all do not want.
As we get set to mark the first anniversary of this invasion, I must end this conversation today by asking you about, you know, looking ahead now to how all of this would possibly play out and the kind of impact it could have on those who are far away from the conflict and who are not directly involved, such as countries elsewhere who are watching closely. But who may the impact of it on them may just be economic, to say. At this point in time, is there anything that they can do to limit their own exposure?
Unfortunately, some of the things that one would expect that we should do with this is learn as Africans. I mean, I'm talking as an African right now, to let everybody know that, one, we need to be more prepared as per what we produce and prepare for ourselves, to feed ourselves, to make sure that we're protected, and the kind of leadership that we get, because then the world is not just about feeding yourself. The world is about being able to negotiate at a particular level, because what you're seeing right now, the fact that people are unable to take decisions decisively, is because all of these countries have been able to build some level of confidence, some level of strength, and people are being cautious the way they're dealing with them. I hope as Africans that we're learning that leadership is not just about bread and butter, you stealing money, corruption, and all of that. It's about building strength, feeding your people, protecting your people, taking advantage, unfortunately, of a time like this to have been able to show up some level of gains. You know, if, for instance, we had done our oil production properly and our gas production properly, we probably will have gained more from this, but unfortunately we did not, because we're not properly prepared. So we're being affected economically and, you know, in so many ways. So yes, the whole world is terribly affected negatively, but of course you're talking about very superpowers, and so everyone is cautious and probably might not be able to do what they would love to do, like they would want to do it at the time they want to do it right now. But unfortunately, I pray that lessons has been learned, particularly for Africa. My concern is, what are we learning from all of this, and how better prepared we will be if such a thing happens in the future?
Indeed, that is the key question. And as we also prepare, at least at the level of Nigeria, for the 2023 elections, one is only hoping that those who want the power are listening to people like you. Thank you very much, Mr. Oluseyi Adeyemo, as always, for your time on the program.
Thank you so much for having me. Have a great day.
And still to come, Ukraine mourns athlete as anger grows over prospect of Russians at the Olympic Games. Please join us again. Thanks for staying tuned. Welcome back. Time for the business angle to all of this. Laddie Williams, as always, is here to give us some of the finer details. Morning, Laddie. Well, the rate hike is in.
Yeah,
I already heard that from Stephen Hayes earlier.
Yeah.
That rise, but not as high.
Not as high.
25 basis points.
25 basis points expected. You know, that was the consensus. And, you know, we did get that. But at the same time, the main attention was to what would be said, after
about the future, which you said yesterday.
Exactly.
What was said?
So it's the same thing, we know the Fed, they've been trying to, let tame markets, basically. Don't get too excited. We're not, leaving our rate hikes yet. We're still there. We're still going to keep raising rates as long as inflation
is still there, and it's still a worry.
It's still a worry. But at the end of the day, that magic word, he said, disinflation, he did recognize, disinflation. So the markets, actually enjoyed that. Investors, reacted, like, okay, this is good news. He notices that inflation is actually, on a downward trend. But now, obviously, we know the Fed, they want to see that sustained, downward trend. We have 2 more inflation reports before the next meeting, so it depends on what happens.
What has in those reports?
In those reports. So if we see any uptick, obviously the party is over. But as it stands, risk on is what we're seeing at the moment.
And of course, you are referring to
the markets.
Yes, to the markets, and then you're referring to Jerome Powell, because some people listening to you may wonder who is this man.
Yes, actually, Jerome Powell.
And now, of course, I want to suspect that may partly be responsible for the fact that the dollar has dropped to a 9-month.
Exactly, yeah, because in 2022, when they were going hard with the rate hikes, 75 basis points back to back, we saw the dollar, the DXY react positively to that. It got to a high of 114 points, against a basket of other top currencies.
The other currencies, yes.
But now, with that 25 basis points, while the Fed chair was talking, we saw the dollar actually rising, at that point. But immediately he
finished talking.
He finished talking and actually put his attention to disinflation, mentioned that word. We saw the DXY hit a new low, about 9-month low, about 100 points, against other baskets. And, that's why we're seeing what we're seeing right now. It shows that, traders are moving away from safety, because it was safety that drove them to the US dollar in the first place.
Yeah, and now the opportunity seems to be presenting itself for some level of risks.
So with this dovish comments we're seeing, even though it's quite hawkish, but still dovish, that's why we're seeing the dollar actually go down at this point.
Speaking of hawkish, the European Central Bank is also expected to make its own announcement.
Yep. And so the Bank of England.
They shouldn't bring out the drums yet. It depends on what they say also.
Exactly, because they're also pricing in 50 basis points. That's
not 25, ECB, which the Fed did.
Not 25, because obviously they started that party they joined the party late.
Yeah, so they're playing catch-up in many respects.
Catch-up at this time. So they're doing 50, more than the 25 basis points. But, at the same time, we're still looking forward to guidance, from both, central banks, because obviously the issues, the Bank of England is facing a lot of issues.
Indeed.
In the UK at this point, with the strikes, and obviously all of that will play into the inflation story. So as long as they also see inflation going up, they will also keep, raising rates. But with the IMF projection we got for the UK economy, that's also going to be top on the agenda too. Absolutely. So at the end of the day, they don't want to do too much tightening, so you don't take the economy into recession, fully. So there's still that balancing act that, has to be done with the Bank of England and the ECB.
Indeed. Thanks, Laddie. As always, Laddie will have the details along with the team of how the other markets reacted to the U.S. Fed announcement, as well as how it's looking from the ECB announcement as well. Thanks, Laddie.
Thank you.
Let's take a quick look at some other news at this time. More than 1,000 Ukrainian refugees attended a job fair held by the Edith and Karl Marx JCH of Bensonhurst in partnership with the UJA Federation of New York in the neighborhood of Brooklyn in New York. 70 employers from the finance, healthcare, human services, and manufacturing industries were offering job opportunities to Ukrainians displaced by the war. Since Russia invaded Ukraine on February the 24th, 2022, over 14 million Ukrainians have been forced from their homes, according to the United Nations.
Today we're at the Marx GCH. We're having a job fair for Ukrainian newcomers. It's very exciting. We are expecting over 700 registered participants, all newcomer Ukrainians. I think we have well over 1,000, and we have 70 employers from various industries.
I'm very bonded to my place, to my family, and but they pushed me because they are thinking that it would be worse than it is now. But the people there, they are feeling lost because lots of them, they are without any housing anymore, without their past life, without even some, I don't know, small little things that made them happy because they lost everything during shellings and missile attacks. So people are very stressed, but anyway, there is a place for hope. So we are just hoping that someday this war will come to an end, and we will live in peace again someday.
We really can help those who've arrived as recently as yesterday to as recently as 9 months ago who are escaping the war in Ukraine.
And Ukrainian tennis player Elina Svitolina has voiced strong opposition to the possible participation of Russian and Belarusian athletes at next year's Olympics in Paris. Athletes from the two countries are banned from most major sports events in the wake of Russia's invasion of Ukraine. But while continuing sanctions against the two nations, the International Olympic Committee, the IOC, is considering allowing their athletes back as neutrals at events, including the 2024 Olympic Games. The plan has been met with wide-ranging opposition. Ukraine is considering a Games boycott in such a scenario, and Tokyo 2022 bronze medalist Svitolina agreed that the athletes' ban should continue. We must stick to banning Russian and Belarusian athletes, sending a strong message worldwide that we are united in the sanctions imposed against Russia and Belarus, and that there are consequences for the heinous acts of their governments. That's according to a post she made on Instagram. And finally on the program, family and friends of the Ukrainian decathlete Vladimir Andreychuk lined up to bid farewell to the promising athlete killed in the Russian invasion, whipping as they approached his open coffin, partly concealed by the country's blue and yellow flag. At his funeral in the western Ukrainian town of Lechchev, friends of the 22-year-old were categorical. Russians should be excluded from the Olympics now that Mr. Andreychuk had been brutally stripped of his chance to compete on the world's most prestigious sports stage. Since the full-scale invasion, we have strongly reconsidered our position towards Russian and Russian athletes. It's obvious that they are not supposed to be in sports, nor are the 2024 Olympic Games, said decathlete Dmitry Kubenko, who described himself as Mr. Andreychuk's best friend. As mourners parted ways with him, laying bouquet near his feet or kissing his forehead, Mr. Kubenko described his friend as a strong-willed athlete. As a national-level athlete, Mr. Andreychuk, who turned 22 on January the 10th, did not have to fight, but he went to the front line as a volunteer, swapping his tracksuit for fatigues. He was struck in the head by shrapnel last week outside the city of Bakhmut, which has witnessed fierce fighting as Russian troops have intensified efforts to surround it. That's our program this morning. Thanks for being with us. My name is Ladi Akeredoluale. Do have yourselves a pleasant day ahead. Good morning.